My next guests are some of the smartest people involved in diabetes care and innovation, and the data about this. Dr. Ann Peters is the director of the Westside Center for Diabetes at USC. I've had the pleasure of talking to her in the past. She's a clinical medicine professor at the Keck School of Medicine of USC. Marie Aitken is the executive director of IQVIA at the Institute for Human Data Science, which integrates data science, technology, and human science. I am a wonk on this stuff. I can't wait to talk to him. IQVIA assisted Eli Lilly, the sponsor of today's event, with their recent report on diabetes innovations. And Dr. Fatima Cody Stanford is the chair of the Minority Affairs section of the American Medical Association and also an obesity medicine physician at Massachusetts General Hospital at Harvard Medical School. Really great to see all of you. And Dr. Peters, today as we're looking at this kind of broad question of innovation and that innovation curve meeting patient need. And I just say, just like last time we talked about it, we're sitting in a country right now with a set of tsunamis hitting at once. Whether it's, inequality economically, inequality and health disparities and health sides from COVID. And now we're talking about diabetes today. And we're also talking about, tension in our communities about identity and race, which we've been discussing somewhat earlier. So I guess my question to you, because you work in communities where that are sometimes those that are not that are hit disproportionately by this, is there anything you see out there that might move the curve a little bit in a positive direction as we look at innovation and reaching communities in need with diabetes?
Well, so as you stated, I've spent my career working in well-served and underserved communities. And right. I know that I have the tools to take care of patients when I have access to them and they have access to good health care. And my life's work increasingly is to take what I know I can do and translate it to care in places where they have less access to care. And I really firmly believe that the solutions for those communities obviously must come from the communities themselves. But I also know that the tools we have, if we integrate them in an effective way, can really make a difference. So I'm encouraged about what's possible. I am discouraged about the maldistribution of those tools. And I've never seen it worse than during this pandemic, because my underserved patients are hospitalized and dying, and that is horrible. So I have never felt more the need to create systems of care that take care of everybody. I don't care who you are. You need to get the kind of care that I know I can deliver in my Westside practice. So it's only made my passion for this even stronger.
Well, I remember our last conversation was very, very moved by that. Dr. Stanford, I think tomorrow I'm going to be moderating an event on diversity and inclusion, which the Hill is going to be doing. It's one of the topics I feel is super important, but I also feel like there are fig leaf approaches to it, and then there are real approaches to it, to be candid. And so as you look at communities that have been hit so hard by this, I'd love to hear whether it's in data, whether it's in cost, whether it's in ambassadors to these communities. What are the dimensions to finally get to a point where we've got, I guess, some equality, if you will, of impact, and begin to move this in a way that every community is improving?
So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I think we really have to look at the deep, strong roots of structural racism, which is played out here in our communities. I'm extremely proud, as the chair of the Minority Affairs section for the AMA, to see groups like the American Medical Association taking strong strides to being able to begin to address inequities in care that are derived from issues such as race. So just in our meeting that just concluded with the American Medical Association just this week, the American Medical Association came up with strong statements on racism, for example, as a threat to public health. And if we're looking at that and we're looking at this collision of what we're dealing with in the midst of COVID-19, I think we must recognize that the inequities that our patients face are multifactorial, multifaceted, and we're not going to be able to take, and using your words, the fig leaf approach to attack these issues. We're going to have to look at what we're doing to ensure access to care, much like was stated by Dr. Peters earlier. Access varies widely in underserved versus well-served communities. If we're looking at chronic diseases, such as that of diabetes and or obesity, which of course we know to be the largest chronic disease affecting more than 42% of US adults alone, we have to think about these things. And what we've seen bore out when we're looking at COVID-19 morbidity and mortality is we're seeing significant differences in communities with less access, and particularly communities of color, particularly Black, Latinx, and Native populations. We have to do better. I believe we can, but it's going to take a multidisciplinary approach to make it happen.
I really appreciate that. Dr. Aitken, I am a data wonk. I admit it. So we've got that in common. And I think along the lines that Dr. Peters and Dr. Stanford said, I'm always interested in whether there are bank shots out there that we haven't thought about. I mean, I think a lot of Washington is filled with good people who want to move policy forward. They move it incrementally. But data, being able to look at, what's going on in human data science can sometimes give you insights around the corner that might not be obvious. And now that we have so much capacity to measure, there have been so many, leaps in terms of the technology of delivering insulin, monitoring insulin. You know the terminology of this much better than I do, but around that range, do you see bank shots or insights that would be non-obvious about improving care for those patients with diabetes?
Sure. So thanks, and great to be part of this panel and such an important topic. I think what we observe is this real convergence of human science and data science that is coming together, powered by technology. We see the new kinds of digital technologies that are increasingly available. But we also see how data science can interpret data in new and more meaningful ways to create algorithms and interpretation of the data, which ultimately also, in conjunction with the digital health technologies, can help deliver ultimately better outcomes to people with diabetes and actually deliver lower costs overall to the health system. So one area that we've particularly taken a look at is what's referred to as the time and range metric, which is a different way of interpreting glycemic control that goes beyond the traditional HbA1c level and enables us to give a better assessment of the extent to which an individual with diabetes is controlling that diabetes by not just measuring HbA1c levels at a particular point of time, but with a continuous glucose monitoring approach is able to measure that continuously through the day, and therefore enable a metric of time in range to be calculated. How much of the individual's time over a certain period is within a predetermined acceptable range of HbA1c level. And the evidence is becoming clearer about the benefits of focusing on that time and range metric, in particular identifying when a patient remains at least 70% of their time within that pre-specified range, and the benefits that brings ultimately to fewer complications, fewer hospitalizations, and so on. So This is an example where through the ability to create a continuous flow of data through continuous monitoring, we're able to apply data science to develop an algorithm that enables us to bring forward an additional measure for glycemic control, time and range, that goes beyond the traditional HbA1c level.
So thank you for that. So Dr. Peters, as you listen to Marie Aitken and what they're beginning to see in the terms of data, time and range, there's a lot of other terms of this, value-based agreements in terms of kind of looking at what comes out of the package of services. This sounds as if these are features of the community that has resources, that is connected. And I'm just interested, as you hear this and you think about it, what's transportable? Let me just be point blank. What helps you bridge to these other communities, given what we're learning about the convergence of technology, to outcomes? And what do we need to bridge that so that we get a strategic leap to these other communities that aren't part of that picture?
Well, yes, because this all makes me see the healthcare disparities even more. So every single one of my Westside patients has been able to use a continuous glucose monitor. And their data comes wirelessly to my clinic and it's miraculous, and I can look at it and I can adjust them and I keep them safe and they do great. I've spent the past however many months it's been since COVID, but even before then, fighting to get my underserved patients the continuous glucose monitor for the same access. Well, they can't get it because Medi-Cal doesn't pay for it, or Medicaid. They can't get it because they live in dangerous neighborhoods, and if it gets delivered to their door, it gets stolen. They can't use it because they don't have smartphones. If they happen to have a receiver to use it, they don't have a computer to plug in the receiver. So I can't even get their data, even if I get them a continuous monitor to help them. So I've been really killing myself lately trying to write a grant that uses these tools and the time and range, which I really believe in, and the ability to monitor this data remotely to help my underserved patients, and working with my Latinx community in East LA to make this happen. But first, I have to get funding to get this. But I personally believe that if we take these tools, integrate them in the community, even if that means purchasing cell phones for them, but doing this in a way that's very acceptable, because a lot of these tools, you don't see people of color even wearing them. I've fought really hard to get the manufacturers to at least put people of color in their ads, because that's, we don't give the right signals out. And then you have to get the data to someone who can interpret the data, who can give it back to the primary care doctors who do most of the patient management. So I want to set up a program that uses people, educators from the communities who can reach out and connect with the patients, who can speak to the primary care doctor to give treatment recommendations. I can set up a system for all this, but it does require that we pay for it up front and then we integrate it into communities. It's completely doable. I know, because I can do it in my more affluent practice. It shouldn't be limited to those individuals, but there are all these different pieces. You can't just give them a continuous monitor. I tried that for 2 years. It doesn't work. You have to give them the monitor, the way to get the data to us, and then a system that can use the data to affect outcomes. So there's a lot of steps, but I'm an optimist, but I'm also, it's so disturbing that I can't do it now. I guess I'm impatient. What can I say?
Well, I think your impatience is well placed, and it's actually admirable. So I like hearing that. Dr. Stanford, in this same line, I'm always wondering, is there a killer app? Is there a bank shot? Is there a way of looking at this? Is there a trusted party that could come in and change, the game? And earlier in the program, I mentioned a former colleague of mine, Olga Kazan, who wrote about a fantastic woman in Baltimore who and her family had lots of chronic conditions. And it essentially was a story of the failure of institutions around this family. This was a good family, had problems, but all of the services set up kind of didn't perform at the level they should have. Johns Hopkins, not too far away, more castle than friend at that time. Maybe things have changed since then. But I guess, in terms, you deal with folks with obesity, chronic conditions, and this. As we think about it, hear Murray Aitken's comments about, and Dr. Peters' comments about the value of this data coming online. Do you see any models, best and promising practices that can make game changers to bring these communities, into the fold, if you will?
So, one of the issues that I see, and, I really want to thank Dr. Peters for her comments. They were just well received as someone who's a researcher and someone who provides clinical care, is that we can get short-term solutions, right? Like we might get a grant from the NIH or something that's sponsored from industry, which allows us to utilize these in communities that look more like mine than not. But that grant funding is short-lived, right? So we can do it, it works well, we feel great about things, and then the grant ends. And then we're back to the beginning of where we started. So we had this progress that may have occurred. And so I think having kind of this continuous dedication to infusion of money to solve these chronic issues is of significant importance. Your guest that was on prior to us coming on talked about, CBO estimates, and how when we're looking at chronic diseases like diabetes and obesity, the CBO estimates don't really account for the longevity of these diseases. When we look at obesity, for example, it's a a chronic, remitting, relapsing, progressive disease. It doesn't just come and go away. Diabetes doesn't just come and go away. It's something that requires our continuous dedication. So what we need to see is sustainability with regards to funding these programs. We have the researchers, we have the people like Aitken here who's giving us, a lot of that science to really inform what we're doing. But if we don't have that funding that's infused and continuous, sustainable over time, we'll continue to see these relapsing, remitting of progress within these communities that really need access more than others, as we see issues like diabetes and obesity disproportionately impact communities of colors at much higher rates than we see in majority populations here in the United States.
I appreciate that. Dr. Aitken, one of the things I do is I go back and look at people's Twitter feed, and I looked at yours, and, in September, you commented on telehealth and that looking at this, that the value of it would be demonstrated in improved health outcomes and cost control, not only convenience and protection from disease. And I was struck by that because I hadn't thought of that before, because I've done a ton of events, Republican, Democratic members of Congress. Everybody loves and embraces telehealth. But, and we've also talked about various devices, CGM and other potential new technologies that are coming into the diabetes treatment space and dealing with that. So I'd love to get your insights since you did that. Are we getting insights into the developments that seem to matter and that seem to be making a difference in health outcomes as opposed to what you critiqued as convenience?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, what is central to actually all of this discussion about bringing the right care to people with diabetes is that it should all be underpinned by evidence. And that evidence is growing for sure. And we need more of it. And the good news is, again, the data is flowing to enable that evidence to be established. And that can be evidence around human costs, clinical costs, economic costs, at an individual, at a community, and at a societal level. I think what's also important is for us to think about who's bearing those costs and who's bearing the risk for treating patients or people with diabetes. And this is where the idea of value-based agreements can also come into play, where there is an opportunity, again, underpinned by data and information to actually rebalance where those costs are incurred and where the risk is taken in order to sort of optimize the solution overall. So I think what we've been learning also over the last 8 months through the increased use of telehealth is this is an alternative site of care that previously was less than 1% of healthcare interactions occurred through telehealth. Now it was as much as 17%, back in April, May. It's down around 10% currently based on our observations. But what we've learned is that this is an alternative site of care. It can be delivered less expensively. It's not a replacement of in-person visits, but it's another tool in the toolbox. And I think we should be, recognizing the value that brings, as we should with all new technologies that are out there. Let's get them harnessed. Let's get the value, directed to the patients, the people who will benefit from it, and let's build it into the system as Dr. Peters and Dr. Stanford have been discussing.
It's really great. Let me ask you all, I'm going to start with Dr. Peters. I followed my tweets too, and there's a guy, and I'm going to give him a nice shout out, Mike Rattray, who was not thrilled with my conversation about the FDA with Congressman Burgess. And he says, banging on the FDA from a position of no knowledge. I have a little knowledge of how the FDA has stepped in over the last 8 years in a good way isn't necessarily helpful. And then he said the FDA has developed a framework for open-sourced artificial pancreas, which was one of the topics, that he thinks would be very good for patients. And so my question really is, and I like when people challenge me, it kind of makes me think as well, But I'm wondering where that delicate balance is between innovation, the need to invest, and the need to kind of get great, access and keep affordability in place, but also the regulatory piece of it. And, since you're applying for grants and since you're trying to apply new methodologies, devices, things that might work and bring data in, has the FDA been in a good place, do you believe, or do you think the FDA needs to modernize, if you will, some of its approval processes? I'd just be interested to throw Mike's comments out for further discussion. Dr. Peters?
Well, so it depends on which part of the FDA you're talking about. So when it comes to the device part of the FDA and their regulation of devices for people with diabetes, I think they've done an outstanding job. And they've hired a number of people that I've had the pleasure of working with, including Courtney Elias, who's wonderful, who's really championed improving care for people with diabetes in terms of using technology. And so she's allowed technology to develop. She's encouraged the right kind of development. Now, not everybody's perfect. Trust me, I know this, and it's an institution. But I've really seen incredible innovations in technology that have been through the device division. The pharmaceutical division is different, and they're still have a lot of the older standards, and we're trying to actually get some of the device data more routinely integrated into what they're doing on the pharmaceutical side. So there's an integration, but I think for diabetes, at least in terms of the FDA, innovation has been creatively driven by the device division. And yes, my patients on the Westside do amazing things. They do these do-it-yourself systems where people on Facebook have wonderful non-FDA approved ways of treating their diabetes. I am not recommending this, but I'm telling you that it's been something that has really been possible because we've had limit to people right now with type 2 diabetes who need access.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Let me go to Dr. Stanford and get your thoughts on this. Again, I want to be fair to all commenters, but, looking at institutions and what I'm saying is, either things are great and gravity's going in the right direction, or we got to shake things up and do it a little differently. So where are you in this?
Oh, I'm about the shaking it up of things. So I really see that we have access to different forms of therapy for the treatment of diabetes. We have different devices. We have all these things, but it doesn't matter if our communities don't have access, right? It's like if you have something that's there as a nice shiny object that's really kind of behind the window and the store that you pass by that you never get access to. And that's really what I'm seeing for many patients of color, patients that are from communities that really need access to this care. The care that, as we talked about earlier, that these disease processes that we're talking about, diabetes, obesity, disproportionately impact communities of color. We've seen this bore out in mortality rates for Black individuals like myself that are twice that of white individuals coming in with COVID. Recognizing that obesity rises to the top of consideration, for example, for those that are infected with COVID and actually have severe disease. But the problem is our communities just don't get access to them. And so we really need to shake things up. We need to recognize these inequities, not just for this moment in time where we're paying more attention to these issues, but, what are we going to be doing in a year or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years down the road? Is the plight going to be improved for those that look like myself?
Thank you for that. Dr. Aitken, I'm going to give you the last word on this. But another piece of this we haven't talked very much about, in addition to responding about FDA and shaking it up, is whether, things like VBAs and others, whether there's what's out there in the lexicon you see that could be game changers as well in terms of, changing this scene for patient care in diabetes?
I think definitely value-based agreements have a lot of opportunity to, again, as I would put it, rebalance who's incurring the risk and who's seeing the benefits of some of these new technologies being applied. So it's a way to systematically set up metrics that underpin these agreements and where the proof is in the pudding and depending on real patient outcomes, the amount of reimbursement, changes. That's a mechanism that can really create win-win-wins for the payer, for the patient, as well as for manufacturers. And I think there's a lot of openness to this. We need to get Medicare into the act, given their role as a payer. We need to create the flexibility to be able to enter into these contracts without tripping up over sort of other regulatory or legislative hurdles. We need to have the information flowing that again is required to underpin the sort of execution of these arrangements. And by the way, these sorts of value-based agreements, can also be a way to address some of Dr. Stanford and Dr. Peters' concerns about communities of particular concern, where there can be a weighting, if you like, in terms of the value that's delivered to particular segments of the population. Again, if we have a robust platform for value-based agreement, then we can apply it in a flexible way and address some of these issues actually head on.
Well, look, I really appreciate this. I guess I live in a kind of world where I'm hoping that our investments in science, investments in technology, investments in new methodologies and framings will allow us to leapfrog from those communities that have to those communities that are not in that circle, and figure out that's part of the moral responsibility I think we have in these discussions. And I'm really grateful for your perspective. So many thanks to Dr. Ann Peters, Director of the Westside Center for Diabetes at USC, Dr. Fatima Cody, Stanford, the Chair of Minority Affairs Section of the American Medical Association, and Murray Aitken, Executive Director of the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science. I really appreciate your candor and thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.